I'm Al, but I go by G. Allen Nelson. And I was born in Summit, New Jersey, which is a commuter town for Newark, New York, all commuters. It's about 20 miles west of New York City, and I was born in 1922, so this May 6th I turned 85. I was in my first year of college at the University of Texas in Austin. I was in my first year there, I was a sophomore majoring in petroleum geology. We all went out on Sunday morning on the front porch and everybody was saying, where the hell is Pearl Harbor? Nobody had ever heard of it, so I was in my second year of college, my first year in Austin, Texas. I enlisted in something called the Enlisted Reserve Corps, ERC, Enlisted Reserve Corps of the U.S. Army, and I went into the Army on May 8th, 1943. I was just finishing my junior year of college. I was just finishing my junior year of college when I went in, May 8th, 1943. I went to Camp Maxey in Paris, Texas, 100 miles northeast of Dallas. We had a first lieutenant who told us that he said that our basic training, we were all college kids in the ERC. He said that our basic training was harder than when he'd gone through officer candidate school at Fort Benning. When we enlisted, they told us you'll have infantry basic and then you'll all go back to college in uniform, which we did. Thousands of us went into colleges all over the country. It was called ASTP, it was called Army Specialized Training Program. When I enlisted May 8th of 43, I spent the whole summer in basic training. In September, I went to Sam Houston State Teachers College in East Texas, 60 miles north of Houston. I was there from September of 43 until March of 44. March of 44, they took thousands of us from all over the country and threw us in the infantry because they thought that their casualties would be so tremendous on the Normandy invasion that we were going to fill in for those who were wounded and killed in the invasion. So for everybody all over the country, it only lasted 6 months. Well, what happened was we couldn't believe it. There's nothing worse than going back to where you had your awful basic training. So I ended up going back to Camp Maxey where I'd had basic training and thrown into the 99th Infantry Division. So all of the summer of 43, I had my infantry basic. 1 year later, same place, Camp Maxey, the whole summer of 44, I had my infantry basic all over again. So I had infantry basic twice.
When did you go overseas?
We left Boston. We left Boston on September 28th of 1944. Took us about 12 days to go overseas to England. I ended up down on the south coast of England in a little country village. I ended up down there outside of Dorchester. We were only there about 3 or 4 weeks, training, marching, and doing different things. So we were only in England about 3 weeks before we went across the channel to go into combat. I think that we went on the line in our foxholes about the 6th of November. By the time that we got over there, that American troops were right on the German border. The Germans were right at the top of the hill, and we didn't know it at the time, but the Germans were right up on the international highway. The international highway running north-south, separating Belgium from Germany, was right at the top of the hill, so thank God we missed the Normandy invasion. So we were right on the German border by the time we got there, in what was known as the Ardennes Forest. All that we did was go on night patrols. Just before the Battle of the Bulge, we had gone into the foxholes of the veteran 9th Infantry Division that had been over there and fought in North Africa. We went in the foxholes left by the 9th Infantry Division, and we were in a holding position. We weren't attacking. We were supposed to go out on night patrols and try to capture Germans to find out who they were and some idea of how many there were. The Battle of the Bulge started at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th. About 3 days before that, they said, I Company, you're going off to the northeast and capture Rath Hill. We call it Rat Hill. So my rifle company, I Company, took off and went up and captured this hill. We were right on the Siegfried line, right on the edge of the forest. We could look across these fields and see a giant big concrete German pillbox, which was just inside Germany. And we captured Rath Hill, and we'd only been up there about 2 days when at 5:30 in the morning, we heard this tremendous artillery barrage. Giant German searchlights were going all over the skies, and they were blowing these sirens. We heard all this hollering and shooting, but that was just south of where we had been for a whole month. So luckily, we were so far up northeast that we didn't see a single German that first day. We knew that we were completely surrounded the first night of the Battle of the Bulge. We knew that we were completely surrounded, but we didn't see or hear one single German until the next morning, the second day, when all hell broke loose. It was complete confusion that we didn't know who was where, we didn't know what was happening. There were only 3 dirt roads going through the forest. The top Allied brass said the Germans will never come through here. There's only 3 dirt roads through the forest. The roads aren't big enough for German tanks to come through. They overlooked the fact that the Germans had come right through there in about 1940, and they captured all of Belgium in just a few days. They completely overlooked that. But we had complete confusion. We didn't know what was happening, who was where. It was complete confusion. A lot of it was where the Germans could see us. They could see us, we could see them. A rifle fire, but on top of that, they were probably shooting a lot of mortars at us, and we couldn't see where the mortars were. They were so far back we couldn't see them. And the worst thing were the 88s coming from German tanks, and they were far enough away to where we couldn't see any where the German artillery was. It wasn't within sight, but one of the worst things were the mortars, and they weren't too far away, but we couldn't see them. We had mortars. We had a very famous situation in another regiment. I was in the 393rd Regiment. In another regiment, this guy, a very brave guy, that the Germans were so close that this mortar man, he had his mortar set at 89 degrees. It was 1 degree from vertical. The Germans were so close, he set his mortar at 89 degrees, so when the mortars came down, they were almost hitting him. If he'd had it 1 more degree, they would have come on top of him. He had to set it at 89 degrees to catch the Germans who were so close to him. I think that there were 12,000 Germans were attacking 1,000 of us. And since our top brass said the Germans will never come through there due to the woods, the roads, the topography, we had a 12-man squad holding a platoon. A platoon would normally have about 36, 40 guys. 12 men were strung out where a 40-man platoon would be. A 40-man platoon was strung out where a 180-man company would be. A 180-man company was spread out where about 1,000 battalions should be. So we were spread terribly thin. Well, it started at 5:30 a.m. was the huge attack, 5:30 a.m. December 16th. We fell back. The 99th and the veteran 2nd Infantry Division were fighting right next to us, side by side. We pulled back out of the forest and went back to a little village called Elsenborn Ridge, and right around Christmas time, the Germans had repeated attacks against Elsenborn Ridge, and we stopped the Germans on Elsenborn Ridge, the 99th Division and the 2nd Division. Hitler's plan was to go, the shortest route was through the twin villages, Krinkelt Rockirath, where my monument is, the twin villages to the village of Elsenborn, to the large city of Liège, Belgium, and then on to Antwerp. And Hitler had this grandiose idea that if he could get across the Meuse River, past Liège to Antwerp, Belgium on the coast. That was the big supply port where all the munitions and tanks and trucks, replacements, everything was coming in this giant seaport, and Hitler thought if he could capture it in 3 or 4 days that the Allies would surrender and that we'd give up, and then he could turn around and send all his troops on the Eastern Front. And of course, instead of being past Liège or the Meuse River or Antwerp in 3 or 4 days, that we had him stopped. He couldn't get past Elsenborn Ridge. And we resent the fact that when they had big celebrations after the war that I have been at in Belgium, all you hear about in the Battle of the Bulge is the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, which is southwest of us. Well, the truth of the matter is that as great as the defense was of the 101st Airborne, when the Germans could not capture the town of Bastogne, they went around and kept going. The most direct route was up Elsenborn Ridge where we were. We stopped the Germans on Elsenborn Ridge. The 101st Airborne down at Bastogne just delayed them. When I went over for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge in 1994, at 5:30 a.m., December 16th, 1994, exactly 50 years to the minute that the Battle of the Bulge started, we had a ceremony up in the woods right up by the International Highway just inside Germany. And we had TV cameras and press there from all over Europe. And they played a recording, and you could hear the cannons and the rifles and everything. They played a recording of exactly how it sounded the minute the Bulge started 50 years before. And well, they had a group picture of we 13 guys from the 99th at the crack of dawn up in the forest. My wife saw me on the national news in the States that night on ABC. And anyway, the big celebration was at Bastogne, and which wasn't right because they had delayed the Germans, but we had been the ones that stopped them. Well, that's incidental. Well, there were only 13 of us. But when I was on the plane coming back from Belgium, from Brussels. There were a bunch of guys that were on the plane from the 101st Airborne, and they had been at the big celebration at Bastogne. I sat down and I talked to the editor of their newspaper, and we have a wonderful newspaper. He knew our editor real well, and I said to the editor of their newspaper, the 101st Airborne, I said, we had 13 guys up at Bullingen celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 99th. I said, how many guys did you have at Bastogne who'd been there 50 years before? He said, about 20. I felt very good that we'd had 13 and they hadn't had many more than us. And he said, but, he said, I think he said we had a whole battalion from the 101st Airborne, which is now at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He said that cost we taxpayers $1 million. They had a whole battalion of the active 101st Airborne. They came to Bastogne, and I think he said that cost us taxpayers $1 million. But I felt good that we'd had 20 guys, almost as many as them. We'd had 13 there, and they'd had about 20. Our wonderful newspaper is called the Checkerboard. And it comes from Marion, Kansas, which is about 60 miles northeast of Wichita. Our newspaper is so good that we also we print the newspaper of the Big Red One, the famous 1st Infantry Division. Our editor was so good that we get the Checkerboard from Marion, Kansas, and the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division, their newspaper comes out of the same office.
We hear about the cold. How bad was the cold?
Oh, that when your feet are frozen, and they turn black, and when you get real bad, the nurse will take the dressings off and the toes will fall right off. That what happened was we never had a change of socks. So when your feet got wet, you didn't have any other socks to put on. So it was bitterly cold. We didn't have good footwear. We should have had galoshes. We didn't, just leather shoes. The 99th Division, my division, had the worst. They had the worst trench foot of any divisions in World War I and World War II. And we were losing so many dozens and dozens and dozens of guys with trench foot, not the Germans, but our own guys, because they didn't have a dry pair of socks. The division commander, Major General Walter E. Lauer, who I was a bodyguard for after the war, General Lauer blamed the GIs and said, if you can't take care of your feet, if you have to go beyond a battalion aid station, it's going to be an automatic court-martial. So I heard that there were guys at battalion aid station right behind where we were. I heard there were guys at battalion aid station whose toes were black and they wouldn't go on to England like they should have for fear they'd be court-martialed. And I don't know if I'd ever told you this, but my wife was an Army nurse at Camp Carson during World War II when she graduated from the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. And she had all trench foot cases. And she told me many times, she said, Dad, when I'd report for work in the morning and I'd go out on the wards that I was in charge of, that she said, when I'd open the door to go out on the ward, that the smell of decaying flesh just about knocked me over. And she had all trench foot cases. One of my best friends, this is typical, He lived here for a long time. One of my best friends was in a different regiment than me. I got to know him after the war through the oil business here. When he got off the trucks to go up to his foxhole, he was by a village that was north of where I was called Kelder-Herberg. The first day when he got off the trucks that brought him all the way from Le Havre, France, when he got off the LST on the channel, got off the trucks, he was supposed to walk up to his foxhole. He had to walk through a stream. The first day going to his foxhole, he had to walk through a stream, and he froze his feet so bad that got trench foot the first hour. First day, he froze his feet so bad by having to walk through the stream, the water in bitter cold, that he went back to England, and he never came back to combat until the middle of March at the Remagen Bridge. And that was typical. If there were a few guys that somehow had gotten a second pair of socks, what they'd always do is they'd put it under their armpits to warm the socks before they put them on. But I don't remember anybody I knew getting a second pair of socks until you went to the hospital. So we had the infamous distinction of having the worst trench foot record of any troop. And I mean, if you lost a guy that way, that was as good for the Germans if you lost him with trench foot as it was for a German to shoot him. We had lots of replacements, and this happened many times that you're up in the woods night and day, and you don't dare stick your head above the top of the ground for fear a German will shoot you. You only get out at night, and in thousands of cases in combat, a replacement would come. We call them saltwater replacements. They'd just come from the States across the Atlantic. In thousands of cases, the only guy that even knew their name was the sergeant. They'd say, well, Nelson, we're going to put you in the 2nd Platoon, 3rd Squad, 10th Man. And so they'd put a guy in the foxhole. The only one he would know would be his foxhole mate. And frequently they'd get killed or wounded, and nobody even knew their name except the guy in the foxhole with them and the sergeant that put them there. Those of us who'd come from the States, we had so many replacements, we didn't know who they were, unless they had put them in the foxhole with you. I tell you that the first day of the Bulge, December 16th, that night we knew we were completely surrounded by the Germans, but never saw or heard one. The next morning was bright and sunny, and I don't know how, but somehow I ended up with a German tank on a dirt road in the forest firing point blank at me. And I never will know why they didn't try to kill me. But I'm behind a little mound of dirt and the tank is firing at me, and I think that on each side of me, machine gun bullets were ripping up the dirt, and I heard this young kid scream, and he was about just 5 or 6 feet from me. I knew he was a young kid from Ohio, but that's all I knew was he was from Ohio. And I looked over, and that same German tank had shot his whole foot off, and that just a big old shiny knob bone was sticking out. His whole foot was gone. And he was screaming, and I couldn't stand it. When the tank stopped firing, I went over and I dragged him off to the side, and to this day, since I was carrying a bazooka, I would think that the tank would have tried to kill me because I could really hurt them with my bazooka. And I will never know why they didn't continue firing at me, but they didn't when I went to give them first aid. I dragged them off to the side where the German tank couldn't see him, and we had a brand new lieutenant that we just gotten from the States. I didn't know anything about him. I knew he had a Polish name. So he said, "Give me your belt, Private." So I gave him my belt, my GI belt, and he put a tourniquet on it. I thought, heck, that kid's, his whole foot is shot off. All that's sticking out's a shiny bone. I thought he's bound to go into shock, and that'll kill him. And by golly, he made it. And shortly after we left there, the Germans came, and all our prisoners was there, and the medics and the battalion surgeon. And the Germans said to Dale Clark, "We'll take care of you shortly." And he waited 3 days with that big old shiny bone sticking out, no foot left. He waited 3 days before the Germans gave him first aid. And they cut his leg off in a farmhouse. A German lady doctor, a German woman doctor, said to Dale Clark, "Either I cut your leg off or you die. What do you want?" And he said, "Cut it off." And I think he had his leg cut off on a table in a German farmhouse, and I think the only anesthetic was that she gave him a drink of whiskey or something. He had his leg cut off without an anesthetic. And interestingly, married his Army nurse when so he made it back to the States. And I never dreamt ever that I'd ever see him again, or the lieutenant that put the tourniquet on. And when we went to our first reunion in Dallas in 1989, there was the kid who lost his leg and the lieutenant. That was unbelievable. In 1989, that was about 45 years later. There were those two guys. Many years later, I got a package in the mail one day, and I got a note. It came from Ohio, and I couldn't believe it. And I opened the package, and there was a brand new GI belt, and it was from a kid by the name of Dale Clark. He said, "Al, I'm sorry it took me all these years, but here's a brand new GI belt, to replace the one that you donated on December 16th, December 17th, 1944, up in the Ardennes forest. He sent me a brand new belt. And I wear that belt whenever I go to a reunion, and I'm wearing it right here. And I wrote a letter to our wonderful division newspaper editor in Marion, Kansas, and I told him this story about getting a belt about 40 years later from the one I donated in 44. So the newspaper editor put a headline saying, "You'll get a belt out of this." And I don't know why, I never will know why, but I left. And I went running back through the snow, through the woods. I went running back to a big pyramidal tent where all our wounded were. And as I was running back, the weight of the M1 and the bazooka was so awkward I fell, and I slid in behind this tent where all these wounded were. And a buddy of mine said to me, "Boy, look at that, Stud, you're lucky." And I said, "What?" And I looked up, and there were 3 trees, and a German machine pistol had shot at me, and I could see the bullet hole right through the trees, and if I hadn't fallen, that would have been me. So the awkwardness of running with a bazooka and an M1 made me fall and slide in right below where the bullets would have gotten me. The bazooka slid down into a big old garbage pit. And I thought, oh man, that whoever tried to get me with those bullet holes in the trees, if I come out from behind the tent, he's going to get me. So I thought, the heck with it, and I'll just leave the bazooka there. Well, so I lost my first bazooka, and that was the second day of combat. When the Bulge was over, the end of January, we started going back into Germany. We recaptured all the land that we'd lost, and one day we're tramping through this forest, and all of a sudden we broke out to a big open field, and the snow was about knee deep. So we started going across the open field in a skirmish line. We're all in a line, side by side, going across this field, and we got out in the middle, and a German machine gun right ahead of us started firing at us. Well, we naturally all hit the ground and down in the snow. Well, I went to get up, and when I tried to get up, I had about a foot of snow on top of my bazooka, and every time I tried to lift it up, I couldn't get it out of the snow with the weight of the snow on it, and so I left it. So that was the second one I left under fire. I had a brand new replacement from the States carrying my bazooka shells, and we'd been marching for an hour or two through the forest. And I said, "Where's my bazooka shells?" He said, "Oh, they were too heavy, I threw them away." The next day, when I couldn't lift my bazooka out of the snow, one other thing I thought in leaving it was that, hell, I don't have any shells. He threw them away. Shortly thereafter, a sergeant came up to me and said, "Nelson, you're in real big trouble." I said, "What did I do now?" He said, "The company commander, Captain Koch, is going to court-martial you for throwing away 2 bazookas." But he never did. But I lost both of them under fire, and the second one, I had no shells. When the tank was firing at us, that's the only time I was ever within sight of a tank, and there again, I had no shells because the guy that was carrying my shells had just had his whole foot shot off. I had no shells then, and then I found out that the same lieutenant, Frank Pekovich, the same lieutenant I found out had, before I got there, had told another guy to hit that tank with his bazooka shells, and I think it had been so damn cold they didn't work. They didn't do any good. And I know a bazooka man in my division who lives in Boulder, Colorado, and I asked him, I said, Paul, did you ever got to fire your bazooka when you got to Germany or Belgium? He said, yeah, I got to fire it one time. The lieutenant said, hey, Private Riley, fire it and see if it works. He said, I fired it one time, I hit a tree. But the only time I was ever really around a tank was when it was trying to kill me, and there again I didn't have any shells, but I was so wrapped up in saving the kid that I'd given no thought to using my bazooka, plus the fact that I wouldn't have had any shells. But the company commander didn't know that. The battle started December 16th, and it ended about January 26th. And the most important thing to ever remember about the Battle of the Bulge is that, not to take a thing away from, it took 10 years. It took 10 years to kill 58,000 Americans in Vietnam. 58,000 in 10 years. In the Battle of the Bulge, we had 19,000 killed in 1 month and 10 days. In 40 days, we had 19,000 killed. In 40 days, almost half as much as were killed in Vietnam in 10 years. That, on the trench foot, that was the worst winter. That was the worst winter that they had had in Europe in 25 years.
Did the Germans have the same problem, or were they better equipped?
See, I don't know. Well, I would say they had the same problem, because what happened when my wife was an Army nurse during World War II at Camp Carson, besides all the American GIs, mostly American GIs on the wards that she was in charge of, she had one ward that had 60 German prisoners. And they had their own medics, that besides the German infantrymen being captured, we also captured their medics. Well, my wife told me that their own medics who'd been also captured would take care of the German prisoners, but what would happen would be, when it was more than the German medic could handle, they'd call for her and she'd go on that German ward to do whatever she had to do. But understandably, they never let her go on a ward with 60 Germans without an American GI with her for protection. But I'm just guessing if they had 60 Germans in the Springs, that I'm guessing that they might have had it just as bad as we did. I don't know whether they ever got dry socks or not. Germans, they would take the shoes and socks off an American wounded, an American dead, and PWs. American PWs who were walking, the Germans would take the shoes off and socks off them and leave them barefoot. But the Germans would typically, they'd take them off at a dead GI, a dead GI or wounded GI. They'd steal their shoes and socks. And we had shoes, and they had hobnailed leather boots that came up to about here.
March 13th was not a good day for you, was it?
No, that was the worst day of my life. That the 9th Armored Division had captured the Ludendorff Railroad Bridge, which had been there in World War I, 1918. And Remagen was south of Cologne. And the 9th Armored couldn't believe it when they came over the hill and looked down and saw the bridge intact. And the Germans, they tried to blow it up and the charges didn't go off. So they ran across it and captured it. And I must have gone, that was March 9th of 45. That must have been they captured it March 9th. I ran across it March 12th, 3 days later, because the day after I ran across it, I was wounded. It was March 13th, and I was in 2 very bad patrols in the morning. And in the afternoon, my foxhole mate and I decided to get out of our foxhole. There was a dirty puddle of water over there, and we got little cigarette packs all the time. We got little packs with 3 or 4 cigarettes. We were going to go over there and scoop up the dirty water to drink it. And we no sooner got out of our foxhole than we were hit by probably a mortar shell. And my wonderful buddy Makritis was here, and I was here, and the shell hit there, and he got it all up and down one side. So I did like you always do. I started hollering for a medic. When the medic came, he jumped in on top of us, and he had a Charlie horse, and his leg was straight out, and he couldn't move it. And he's laying on top of me and Makritis, and he can't move his leg. And I knew that Makritis had a very bad wound in his hip. I knew I had to get him a medic real fast. So I went out and I got on this road going through the woods, and I saw a first aid jeep up at the top of the hill. So I went up there and I said, hey, you got to go down and get my buddy. And the guy said, I'm not going down there with all that shrapnel flying around. And I said, you're going down there, I'm going to kill you right here. I looked out, and they were carrying Makritis out of the woods onto this road. So they took us back to an old farmhouse, which was a battalion aid station. Then they took us down the hill about 3 miles to division headquarters, which they call collecting station. And so anyway, they hauled Makritis off, He died right after he got to the States. They had amputated his whole leg in Paris, but the gangrene from the wound was, they went as high as they could, amputated his leg, but the gangrene from the wound went higher. He died right after he got to the States. It had to be, it was March 13th, it had to be a Friday. And so when I wrote home to my folks, I told them I'd been wounded, but I was fine. And I got a little piece of shrapnel about that big in my shin bone. I didn't know it until I ran up the road to get that first aid jeep, and I noticed my pants were bloody, and I had this little piece of shrapnel. I'd been in 2 bad patrols in the morning, wounded in the afternoon. The ambulance, what scared the living hell out of me was the ambulance that was on a bunch of engineer boats lashed together. So I went across the Rhine in an ambulance on these boats lashed together, and all I could think of was the ambulance rolling off and me being at the bottom of the Rhine. That scared the living hell out of me. We got on the other side, and the ambulance that I was in, it was traveling with night lights, and night lights are just like this. No headlights, but so you don't have headlights on when the Germans are within sight. So we only had night lights on, and we had a head-on collision with a 6x6 truck. We were knocked into a farmer's field that had been plowed, and we were all walking wounded. We were all sitting side by side looking at each other on each side of the ambulance, and we couldn't get out the back door because it was up against this plowed farmer's field. So as we went out through the front door, the driver was knocked out and he was over the wheel, but none of us were hurt. The ambulance driver was knocked out, you know, on the impact when we had the sudden stop. His head would have hit the wheel, I imagine, and knocked him out, but we weren't hurt. But it was such a severe jolt to be moving and hit the big truck. And we're sitting sideways. We're sitting side by side looking at the guys on the other side looking at us. And it felt like somebody had ripped my rear end open with a can opener. That's what it felt like, the sudden jar about somebody had ripped my rear end open, but none of us were hurt. Well, I was operated on at the Hermann Göring Maternity Hospital in Aachen, Germany. So when I wrote home to my folks and they got it in the local paper, it said I'd got a minor shrapnel wound, but I was okay. I said I'd given birth to twins at the Hermann Göring Maternity Hospital in Aachen, Germany. Twin pieces of shrapnel. Well, actually it was just one. But that was the worst day of my life. We got back to this, what they call an evacuation hospital. And I think it was in a schoolhouse, but I'll never forget, there were so many wounded in this one big room that some of them were even sitting on top of file cabinets. But what I'll never forget is that, God, there must have been 80 or 100 in this one big room and only one nurse. And I would say there might have been 3 or 4, maybe 5 doctors, but I'll never forget that. All those wounded and a few doctors, I'll never forget, and only one nurse, because they were so short-handed. At the evacuation hospital, I would say maybe 2 or 3 hours, and then they drove me on to Aachen, which is just inside Germany from Belgium. They drove me to Aachen and took out that little piece of shrapnel, and they had a piece of metal sticking out of my shin bone, and they thought it might be about that long, so they made a big incision. They made an incision about that long in my shin bone, thinking it was a big slug, and thank God it was just one little piece. I was either operated on that night or the next day. They put me on a train from Aachen, Germany, west of Liège. I went from the 32nd General Hospital in Aachen to the 56th General Hospital in Liège, Belgium, where they sewed up my wound. And then they took me on a train to Reims, France, where I ended up in the 108th General Hospital. Well, what happened is, when you've been wounded, they send you to, I was in the First Army. So when you get out of the hospital, they send you to the First Army Replacement Depot in a place called Étampes, France. Everybody that's wounded gets a 3-day pass to Paris. So they sent me out of the hospital to Étampes. I turned right around and went into Paris for a 3-day pass. So what happened was, and then when you're going back to rejoin your rifle company, you keep going from one replacement depot to another, to another, to another. So to answer your question, I was wounded March 13th, and I never got back to my company in southeastern Germany. I never got back until about my birthday on May 6th. So I was gone from March 13th to April 13th to almost May 13th. So I was, with my little old piece of shrapnel, I was gone just 1 week short of 2 months. And most of the time was just going from one replacement depot to another. The day that I reported back to my rifle company, we'd stopped fighting. They stopped, and they were just waiting to hear the signing of the armistice. And there are a lot of guys that were killed that last month, and thank God I missed that. I rejoined my company. The fighting had stopped. A few days later, they announced that Germans signed the treaty, the war was over. They came to me and said, "Hey, Nelson, would you like to be an MP down at regimental headquarters or battalion headquarters?" And I was in a little old village, and I thought, yeah, I would much rather be in a larger city, so I said, I'll go. They didn't take me to battalion or regiment. They took me right to division headquarters, and I was a bodyguard for the commanding general, Major General Walter E. Lauer. And two things, he was very tall. They said, "Nelson, you qualify. You gotta be 6'6". The general says he wants you 6'6", as tall as he is, and you have to have been with the outfit ever since you left Texas." So I ended up being a bodyguard for the general. And then what happened was they took my division, the 99th, and they sent home all the high pointers who had made the Normandy invasion. But since I'd never gotten there, since I hadn't been in the Normandy invasion in June, and I had not gotten there until early November, I didn't have enough points to go home with my division. So they sent me to the 83rd Division. Well, since I had been in the MP platoon as a bodyguard for the general, when they sent me to the 83rd Division, they put me in the division MPs at the 83rd. And unbelievably, they needed cooks, and I thought, well, I've got one Purple Heart. I lost 2 bazookas under fire. I thought, man, I do not want to land on the beaches of Japan with my M1 and my bazooka. So when they needed cooks, I said I'd be a cook, and I walked in one day, I said, where's all the cooks? And they said they went home on high points. So I was a mess sergeant. I was the mess sergeant and still a PFC, and came out of PFC after 33 months. I would say most guys that I know of never want to ever talk about anything that happened to them. You see that in our division newspaper. Everybody's writing in, did you know my dad? What did he do? Where was he and whatnot? And I never could ever mention anything about it until about 10 years ago, and now I can't stop. Well, you know, we have our Remagen Bridge Society luncheon, and my wife and I, we have gone to most of the reunions. When we went the first one in 1989, until the last few years, we went to most of them. And you go to see your buddies, but, you know, as you know, that I believe there's 1,500 World War II vets dying every day, you know. Well, yeah, we exchange experiences. Some of them are quite comical, but usually they're just how bad it was. I would say a lot of them have been wounded at least once, but we don't have that many anymore. That when I put on the convention here in '93, the next year we went to Indianapolis. That in '94 in Indianapolis, we had the most guys we'd ever had in our company, and there would have been about 10 guys and 10 wives. Well, we were a lot younger then. We weren't 85 years old like I am now. And now, when I go to Washington for the annual reunion, the end of this August, instead of having 10 guys and wives there, I expect there'll just be 3 or 4. Because the others that used to come, a lot of them have died or physically and mentally can't make it or can't afford it.